Hi guys, and welcome to week 2 of Fundamentals of Ecology Lab. Today we're going to do a short lecture on an introduction to forest ecology, so you guys can have some background. So the first thing we are going to talk about are vegetation dynamics, which is basically how plants are interacting and changing through time and space. So first word I wanted to define is a community. So community is an assemblage of plants in space and time with a complex network of interrelationships, which are both direct and indirect. And there are a few different kinds of plants that exist in a forest community. They can be things like overstory trees, understory trees, shrubs, ferns, mosses, herbaceous plants, grasses, sedges. So there's quite a few that can grow in a forest community. And if you look at the picture, we can see some ferns at the forest floor, and then we see an overstory canopy, which is those bigger trees that are shading a lot of the understory. So species distribution, in another word, the species range is the geographic area where you can find individuals of this species. And then where the species is present, you can look at its abundance. And you can look at things like frequency, which is how many individuals there are of a certain species or how many stems are there. You can look at dominance, and this is often done through basal area, so basically how much area the tree or plant is taking up. And lastly, you can look at importance, which is a sum of the frequency and the dominance. So you're taking into account the size of the individuals as well as the numbers. So what factors do you think determine the distribution of tree species? There's a few things. Climate has a huge effect on it, and this can be things like precipitation and temperature. There's also soil nutrient gradients, where there's lots of nitrogen in the soil or lots of phosphorus, and this can also limit what types of species can grow in that area. And then there's also disturbances, things like where forest fires often occur or where areas are logged. And lastly, there's competition, and this can be competition with other plant species, or this could even be competition with animals through herbivory. So these tree species ranges are dynamic. They're changing in space and time. If you looked at the record 100 years ago, the forests and species look pretty different than they do today, and that's because things like climate change, which change the species distribution, and human intervention also has a pretty huge impact. Disturbance can also change species distributions and ranges to really extreme extents. For example, chestnut blight, which is a parasitic fungus from Japan, actually drove the American chestnut to functional extinction. So it basically took away its range. It can't be found at reproductive age within its once range. So within succession or regeneration, there's two theories that control plant species distributions. The first is organismic, which was created by Frederick Clements, and he basically looks at forest ecosystems as a superorganism that will always have the same species, and as it regenerates through time, it will go through these prescribed steps of different levels of plants and eventually reach a climax community where it will stabilize and stop changing. Then there's the individualistic theory, which is by Henry Gleason, and his is more of the plants are controlled, their distribution is controlled by resource gradients and sometimes competition, but it's not always going to be the same. So this is a picture of kind of what an organismic approach might look like for Clements. So you can see the different stages of plants as you get to the end, the hardwood trees, whereas in Virginia, for example, our climax community is an oak hickory forest, so that's when it would stop changing through time. And Clements believed that the stages of vegetation in succession were like set for the community type. And so if you left an agricultural field to regenerate, it would eventually reach the same climax community it was at before the agricultural clearing. And so this is called succession, as the forest changes as a unit through space and time. And all of the stages or species within the stages are predetermined. And then we have the individualistic approach, which is Gleason. And his is based more on gradients. So it's more stochastic and random, and each species will respond to these various factors differently, which explains the distribution of plants. For example, Gleason would say red maples compete best in shady conditions, which is why you would find them there. Whereas Clements would say this red maple grows here because the other plants growing around it always grow with red maples. So you should always expect to find it. So in science, Clements used to be the more accepted theory, but now actually ecology is looking more at the individualistic approach to forest ecosystems. Here is a nice figure of the different changes over time. So you can see that the first one has these humps that are overlapping a lot, and that's the individual. And then the bottom figure you can see is organismic, and these hills are all on top of each other at different spaces in time. So it's like the stepwise you can see really well in this figure. So we just said environmental gradients are more of what Gleason looks at, so let's talk about those. A resource gradient is a gradient where the constituents are consumed, so like sunlight and moisture are consumed by plants. There's a direct gradient, which has an influence on plant metabolism but is not consumed, so these are things like soil temperature, soil pH, pollutants. And lastly, there's an indirect gradient, which is a combination of the resource and direct gradient. An example is altitude. So if you're a plant at a really high altitude, but you have a lot of soil moisture and it's kind of cool in temperature, you might grow really well compared to if you were on a really high altitude with low soil moisture and a really hot temperature. So it's kind of a response of the other two. So why is this important? How does species distribution affect the function of ecosystems? So where the trees are going, why is that important to the processes and patterns that occur within an ecosystem? The first is that the species distribution can affect the biomass distribution and turnover. So this is important when we think of it in respect to carbon sequestration. If you have a forest full of shrubs, you'll have a lot less carbon sequestration than you would have in a forest full of hardwood oak or hickory species. And then turnover is if a tree dies, is there going to be another tree that grows in its place? And that is also controlled by species distribution. Second, the quality or the chemical characteristics of plant tissue. That is thinking more in terms of nutrients. So if there's a lot of nitrogen in the soil, that can affect the function of ecosystems and in turn affect species distribution. And nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon are all nutrients that affect functions like photosynthesis and respiration and decomposition, which are important to keep ecosystems regenerating and continuing to sequester carbon and grow and be resilient. Third, there's disturbance frequency and severity. So if there's a bunch of fires, it's going to change what species can grow there versus what can't. For example, there's a type of pine tree that it has this really thick coating of wax on the outside of it, and it only gets hot enough to melt the wax during a forest fire. So these trees actually will only seed in forest fires. So they're not always bad. Some species flourish in areas that have high frequencies of forest fires. And then lastly, the ecosystem can be affected by the species in it because it can actually alter the local climate. So depending on if you have a bunch of shrubs again, or if you have a really high canopy, that's going to change how much how much moisture is in the soil, which is going to change the humidity that the forest is releasing through transpiration. It can actually also affect albedo, so the amount of energy that's reflected back into the atmosphere. And it can also affect the sensible and latent heat fluxes. So these effects can be particularly pronounced in low diversity ecosystems because they're not very resistant to these disturbances or changes. If a keystone species is affected, there can be a pretty big response through trophic cascades, and that's where a species like a wolf that keeps the elk population in check is removed from the area, and then the elk eat all of the trees, and that will change the albedo. It'll change a lot of things. It can change diversity. So these functions are really important, especially for the ecosystem services and conservation of forests. So look at this picture. Do you think that this forest is a pretty biodiverse forest? And if not, why? You can compare it to this forest. So looking at the two, personally, I would say the second picture is much more diverse than the first one. The first one actually looks like a pine plantation. So all of those trees look the same age, they're about the same height, and they look like they're planted in rows. And then in the understory, there's really not much going on. Then in this forest, there's a lot of structural diversity. So you can see the trees all are different sizes, which means they're different ages. You have a understory, an overstory, and then you have some herbaceous plants on the bottom. So you're just gonna have a lot more species, both animal and plant, in the second picture. So this heterogeneity of different levels of the forest is important for things like birds and mammals and arthropods. The birds and mammals use the cover for nesting and for foraging, and arthropods need a lot of different kinds of leaf litter as well as different places to reproduce. So it's really important to have these diverse forests, not just plantations. So in a broader extent, species distributions can have a pretty strong impact on ecosystem services. And some ecosystem services include provision, which are things like food, timber, and fuel, and then regulation and support. These are really important to the whole globe. The climate the forest can control, air and water purification, nutrient cycling, flood regulation through erosion barriers, decomposition, biodiversity, and all of these ecosystems do this for free. And we are decreasing the amount of services that they can provide as we decrease forest cover. It's also really important for culture. So a lot of cultures do spiritual things in a forest, and also for recreational reasons. If you like to go hiking in a forest, you want it to be there every time you want to go, and you want it to be healthy and diverse. So that's why it's really important to study these species distributions, especially in light of the ecosystem services that they could be impacting.